Welcome to Super-Exploitation and Resistance, and today we're bringing you dispatches from elections in Latin America. On today's program, we'll have Michelle Munjanattu, who was recently in Nicaragua, Raul Burbano, who was recently in Venezuela, and Teri Mattson, who is actually in Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Honduras, where I'm presently located. And we're going to be talking about elections in Latin America, what it means for the region, what do the results mean in terms of US and Latin America relations. First of all, to begin, Michelle, Raul, Teri, I'm going to share a little bit of a personal anecdote of my experience here in Honduras. I first came to this country in 2009, actually together with Raul, shortly after the coup d'etat that ousted Manuel Zelaya from power. And I remember the motivations that we had when we decided to come to this country. We were all very scared about the kind of precedent that a coup in the region, once again, in the 21st century would mean. It was a very frightening time, and we thought that we should at least do everything possible to try to intervene and stop this coup from being consolidated. Obviously, we know what happened. We unfortunately saw that the coup was consolidated despite valiant efforts by the resistance on the streets and the international solidarity movement. And of course, the role of US imperialism was critical in consolidating that coup. And what we had as a result was 12 brutal years of rule by the National Party dictatorship, effectively, because this was a regime that lacked any kind of legitimacy as a result of, first of all, being installed in fraudulent elections shortly after the coup d'etat, barely 5 months later. Obviously, there weren't conditions. And then the election of Juan Orlando Hernandez under very questionable results, but even more suspiciously, his re-election in 2017, that even the Organization of American States declared as being not free and fair. Now, when the OAS is calling a US ally elections not being free and fair, I think it tells you how bad the situation was. So to be here now in 2021 to accompany the Libre Party, founded in the aftermath of the coup, and all of the social movements of everything that they've gone through, we're talking about, the fights against the extractive projects, the fights against the sedes, the medicine that was falsely given to Honduran patients, all of the situations that we know that this narco government, and when I say narco government, because I think there are very credible and serious allegations against Juan Orlando Hernandez. We know that his brother was convicted of being a narco trafficker. That valiant effort to what it took to actually defeat the coup, it was incredibly inspiring. What this means for the country is that it can now forge a new democratic era. And that's pretty significant because precisely what we were worried about happening in 2009, happening and the coup being consolidated. Now there's an opportunity for all of those brave social movements that have been resisting for more than a decade to be able to work in a space that is safer, more flexible, has the opportunity to actually directly dialogue with the government. I do think it represents an incredible opportunity. And personally, it really meant a lot to me to be able to be a part of that, to be there in both moments and support the Honduran working class and the Honduran social movement. So I wanted to share that little anecdote, and I wanted to ask each one of you if you could also share an anecdote of your experience in your respective countries and what you were doing, something that really stands out to you that helps remind you why we do this kind of work and why it's important for there to be international solidarity in these moments. And if you don't mind, Michelle, I'd like to start with you. Tell us a little bit, what's something that really stood out for you in your experience in Nicaragua?
Thank you, José Luis, for that beautiful reflection on Honduras from 2009 all the way up to the reversal, hopefully, of the coup in 2021. I have just come back from Nicaragua, which witnessed a coup attempt in 2018. That was greatly shocking and also was a signal what was coming for many other countries in the region, from Venezuela and beyond. So what I really appreciated about being in Nicaragua with the Asociación de los Trabajadores del Campo, the Rural Workers Association, is that I really saw that the Sandinista Popular Revolution was on firm footing. And it is now just part of the fabric of everyday life. And it's going to be very hard to reverse this country in which, as Che talks about, free and new men and women exist in the 21st century. One of the most beautiful things from my trip was I was alongside old militants from the Sandinistas who had established the Rural Workers Association, and who had been part of that armed struggle, and today are, eager to pursue a path of peace and building their society. And they have that memory of like comrades lost in the 80s and just how hard it was during the neoliberal period. And today they are there still fighting, but fighting from the trench of education and fostering young militants. And Teri was in the room with me as we were hearing the vote counts at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. in Managua. And just hearing that Sandinismo had taken between 70% and 88% in every department, that's incontrovertible. This revolution is on firm ground. There's a lot that we should be paying attention to that the Sandinistas are getting right. And I think as that after that election, Nicaragua has begun the formal withdrawal from the OAS. I think we can see a lot of good things like that coming ahead. So I'm going to pause there and turn it over to the rest of our speakers.
Raul, you're next. Tell us, what did you feel being in Venezuela? You've accompanied a lot of elections in Venezuela. Tell us, what set this one apart for you?
Thank you, José Luis. Venezuela is always very interesting in terms of what you see and what you feel when you're on the ground in comparison to what you hear when you live in Canada, or at least, outside of Venezuela. And most importantly is I've been going to Venezuela for probably the last 10 years around visiting social movements, accompanying the elections. And outside of, a immensely democratic country and population, you see that people are involved in the democratic process right from the start. They set up simulation tables, months before the electoral process, so people get familiar with the machines. People are, walking around the cities and the towns with their constitutions, and they're very, they can easily school you on any article of the Constitution, whether it's from an electoral process or from, a social program process. And I think that sort of bottom up, grassroots democratic process is so inspiring when you're in Venezuela and you see it, from for example, we had the opportunity to just outside of Caracas to visit the Great Housing Mission, where the Bolivarian Revolution is helping communities to build their own homes that they get to own after, but they're building it from scratch. And when we were in the community, what we saw is the majority of the people who are leading this project, for example, building their own homes, are women. Women are in charge of the engineering, women are in charge of the procurement, women are in charge of the communication. And it's incredible to see how that community empowerment, from building your own home to defending the electoral process or the Bolivarian Revolution, is an ongoing process in Venezuela. And no matter what the United States and Canada and sort of its international allies in the imperialist realm have tried to throw at the Bolivarian Revolution, whether it's an assassination attempt against Maduro, whether it's economic sanctions that have devastated the economy, that have resulted to the deaths of thousands of people, whether it's actual infrastructure, terrorism, the opposition engaging in violence against peaceful democratic process, the people of Venezuela continue to move forward on their path of a socialist Bolivarian vision for Venezuela, even under so many attacks. And I think for that is inspiring to see the people just continue to work for the electoral process.
And Teri, tell us what you think. You're the superstar, having been to all three countries, going from Nicaragua to Venezuela to Honduras. I did Venezuela to Honduras, and I'm exhausted from all this work. It's incredible that you've been able to accompany all three processes. But please tell us what stood out for you from any one of the three experiences.
Well, thank you, José Luis. I have to say it's really wonderful to be sharing this program with all three of you today. I guess for me, having been on the road all month to witness all three elections, and let's not forget there were legislative elections in Argentina on the 14th of November, and also first round presidential elections in Chile on the 21st of November. The three that I went to, presidential elections in Nicaragua, regional and municipal elections in Venezuela, and presidential elections in Honduras. I think the overriding theme for me for the month, and I would also argue is a theme for the hemisphere post-COVID, is this need, desire, fight to preserve national sovereignty. No US interventionism in any form, whether that's boots on the ground, unilateral coercive measures, lawfare, whatever, however you want to frame it. There is a huge sentiment among people on the ground to preserve their sovereignty. And I think that has really led to the growth and success of social movements. I think all of us participating in this conversation today would support the idea that political parties, candidates need to come out of the social movements. That's where the strength is. So whether or not your party is formally holding office or not, your party is still in power on the ground, educating, recruiting, and building, so that you're never off the playing field, so to speak. So that to me is the biggest thing I see people wanting for themselves and to build. I think that has definitively come out of in this, I mean, what many of us are describing as the second wave of the pink tide. I think we're seeing a unity among Latin America and Caribbean countries. I'd also go so far as to say the global South in general. But the lack of response by the global North towards the global South during the COVID-19 pandemic has created alliances among people, humanitarian alliances among people, not just economic, which has been forging because of economic sanctions, but the human connection that many of these countries, human and social connections, are really strong right now. And I think that's really, really coming from some of the leadership here in Mexico, where I'm currently living. There's this vision that the president of Mexico has articulated beginning July 23rd of this year and has gone on to host the Venezuela dialogue, reinitiated the CELAC summits after a 4-year pause. There's dialogue happening now that's really creating a moment in Latin America. And that specifically saw that in Nicaragua with the re-election of Daniel Ortega and the very strong national wins of the PSUV in Venezuela, where the majority of the states have PSUV governors. So, and then of course in Honduras, as you so beautifully put opening the program, Jose, you've seen the people create an opportunity for themselves now with the election of Xiomara Castro to really undo 12 years of a narco dictatorship, of a severe neoliberal government, and all backed by the United States. So there's some really wonderful, inspiring activity now that I believe has a real opportunity to really shift the complexion of the Americas in the coming years.
Thank you, Teri. And I think just to build off on a little bit of what you said in terms of, the pink tide, the red wave that we're kind of seeing in Latin America. And maybe I'll start with Michelle, if you can give me your thoughts on this, is in all three countries where we observed elections recently, Honduras, Nicaragua, Venezuela, it's clear that the progressive forces defeated the reactionary and conservative forces in those countries. So beyond, what it says for the region, and what, if any, will this have in terms of implications for U.S. foreign policy in the region? Do you think it's going to change the way the U.S. imperialism is sort of behaving towards these countries, or you think it's just going to be status quo?
I think that's a really good question for us to grapple with in the solidarity movement. I think the examples of Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela demonstrate how important it is to kind of hold the line of a revolution and kind of earnestly deepen its footprint in all aspects of society, because that is really what has helped some of these projects incubate and have like a safe space to grow. In Bolivia, it's the social movements that helped return the MAS to power. And so I think we have to think about the role that this troika plays in protecting forward movement for all of the social movements, as Teri took the time to mention. So I've been thinking about this. I've heard some discussion that perhaps, that the PSUV government will make some sort of compromise to lift the sanctions. And I'm thinking about the use of unilateral coercive measures. I don't think there's ever going to be a lifting of unilateral coercive measures. I think that these countries and these projects really need to adapt rapidly to what is a new future. There is not going to be a reversal of these policies from Washington. Others might disagree with me, but I think as we saw, the Renacer Act was, I think, put into effect even prior to Nicaragua's elections on November 7th. And it doesn't matter. It literally does not matter what the social movements do, what the governments do. The US has one mission, and that is to destroy these sovereign projects. And so I think I don't see that the US is going to stop using the blunt force or the blunt weapon of sanctions. It's gotten them pretty far without having to get into overt ground warfare. And this is just going to be the tool of the future to ensure the primacy of the dollar and to ensure US dominance of the financial market. So I think in some ways we have to care less about what the US might do and just earnestly build a project. And I think, from my perspective, that's what they are doing in Nicaragua, and I can also speak to that happening to a degree in Venezuela as well.
I would say I think it's important to remember in this moment that was at one time called the pink tide, that the US was distracted. It was engaged in a lot of occupations and military efforts in other parts of the world. And it's now we've seen that with the withdrawal of Afghanistan, that it's turning its attention elsewhere. It's lost a lot of ground in the region to China. And that makes it nervous. US imperialism is nervous. And so that kind of attention always puts people like us, people who believe in these revolutionary transformations, nervous, because their attention on us means that they're more willing to engage in the kinds of regime change efforts that we're seeing in Venezuela. I mean, it's not a surprise that we saw the US react so quickly to both the elections in Nicaragua and Venezuela, because in some ways, those are the processes that are most advanced. Those are the ones that represent the point of the spear in the region. But I won't stick to a pessimistic point of view because I'm actually rather optimistic. Rather than a pink tide this time, I think what we're experiencing is a red wave. And what we're going to have is these processes further and further deepened and more and spread out. There's opportunities for more victories of the left. And of course, it's not just electoral politics, right? It's also the advancement of social movements, the advancement of the trade union movement, the deeper integration that we're seeing through these regional integration projects, the rejection of the OAS. These are really important qualitative advances in the region. And I think that we should really draw inspiration from, but it will require us to be continually mobilized precisely because there is more mobilization, more unity, more disappointment with the way that the world has treated the global South, that we're likely to see a greater reaction from the enemy, in this case, US imperialism.
I love the word optimistic because I personally feel the same way you do, José Luis. I think there is a specific moment right now happening throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think that it is optimistic. And I will digress back to my prior comments where some of this unity or an awareness on the ground among communities is humanitarian, is because of the almost complete neglect given Latin America and the Caribbean, and particularly many Caribbean nations, in the response to COVID-19. So what was built in the early 2000s and then kind of went quiet or out of power has really re-blossomed in a new moment. Also, I think most people who have spent any significant time and or permanently live outside of the United States really see the world already is multilateral in how it functions, with the United States and its quote unquote international allies remaining, holding on to this unilateral paradigm. Most of the world already is multilateral, and you really, really see that expanding through the global South. But Hugo Chavez had envisioned a South-to-South development and trade. That is a real thing. And that has been fueled. It's been a vision, since 1999, but I believe it has been fueled and is growing because of nations looking for an alternative to the US financial paradigm because of how many nations have been pushed out of the global markets due to unilateral coercive measures. So I think you could argue that this whole foreign policy, economic policy of the United States is creating the antithesis of what it was hoping to achieve. And it is optimistic. I like that.
So we're going to switch gears now, and we're going to talk about each country. And my first question is for Michelle. So here in Honduras, we saw the election of Xiomara Castro. And to do so, she had to build a big tent coalition. And she brought in a lot of diverse actors, including some that aren't exactly on the ideologically same ground as her. And I'm specifically talking about Salvador Nasralla, who actually served as her running mate. And he actually said in recent interviews that he considered people like Maduro and Ortega as dictators. And I mention that because, well, it kind of speaks to some of the diverse points of view that exist here in the region, but also, the fact that there are people who hold these views, these pro-imperialist views in the region itself. What would you say to that? How do those comments correlate to the reality you experience on the ground in both countries? So we'll start with you, Michelle, but Teri, I know you also probably have something to contribute here.
Thank you, Jose Luis, for that question. I think that's really an important question for us to grapple with in the global north. I think it is all too common to think of the Sandinista government as a dictatorship and not one sourced in popular power and one that is powered by everyday people. And I think that is a tension that will need to be resolved as these projects deepen in their revolution and as we see movement toward La Patria Grande. So this was my first time in Nicaragua, but I have been studying the country for several years and was really, again, it's just like as when I went to Venezuela for the first time. You can study a country so much, but then to see what it means to make ordinary revolution in everyday life is just another thing. And I saw a country that was at peace. People were not worried. People, you could just take a deep breath and relax in Nicaragua. State services are provided for. The country is nearly over 95% electrified, approaching 90% access to potable water in the furthest and most rural communities. There has just been so many advances that have occurred under this second Sandinista government since 2006. And something that people often say in Nicaragua is, aunque te duela, aquí Daniel se queda. And that is just kind of their approach to their revolution. It's like, even if it hurts you, we're going to remain. And I think that it just speaks so much about the Sandinista revolution is that people realize that as a sovereign country, they have everything they need for their project within their country, and that their people can provide everything for their own future and building the socialist path. And so while all this like right-wing media in Miami and even in Nicaragua's own press, which is very privatized, the Chamorro press, runs free, they can say whatever they want, but the proof is in daily life for Nicaraguans. And as we all saw from the election results, 75% of those who came out to vote voted for the Frente.
Teri, so I was remembering my first day here in Honduras, and we were having coffee. And one of the delegates, who is a great activist, he's obviously in solidarity with Latin America, but even he had this erroneous idea. He came to us and he said, "Oh, we know they weren't free and fair." And both of you and I were like, "What? No, I think you're misinformed." It shows the level of propaganda when it comes to Nicaragua. So same question for you, Teri. Tell us, how do you respond to these kinds of accusations? How does that correlate to what you've seen on the ground, especially being able to compare your experience, say, Nicaragua and Honduras in terms of having free and fair elections?
Well, it's fascinating, and it's also much kind of to have witnessed and absorbed. So regarding Nicaragua, I think that there's been so much external negative media towards the Ortega government that it's a very difficult narrative to get through. And this is why I feel, and I'm certain all of you do as well, it is so important to go visit these countries that have these terrible, Western media attacks against them, because the reality is often completely antithetical to the media narrative. For Nicaragua, all you have to do, as Michelle said, is go and visit, see how peaceful it is, how stable it is, and the economic development in that country that is benefiting the majority of citizens, not any one specific demographic. We're talking infrastructure and institutional projects. And this is, to me, one of the clashes we're seeing play out now, particularly in the global South, Latin America, and the Caribbean. These forms of government and economic systems that are unilateral, neoliberal, pushing for 100% privatization of institutions and infrastructure, versus those governments and economies that are developing countries that are benefiting the citizens first. That is a clash we're seeing play out. And those countries that are resisting neoliberalism, 100% privatization, are in the crosshairs of the United States and its allies. So Nicaragua has really pushed back against that. That country, it's really amazing, as Michelle mentioned, the projects and development in that country since 2007, since the second Sandinista government came to power. The development is really, it's exciting, it's empowering, it's quite beautiful to see that people in rural communities have paved roads through town. You do not have paved roads in rural communities in Honduras. People have electricity and running water in their homes. People have access to healthcare, can send their children to school. These are things that are extraordinarily valued. The other thing I will come back to specifically to Nicaragua, I would like to just refocus on this theme of national sovereignty. The Nicaraguans really, really believe in sovereignty. They have fought for it in a revolution to push the Somoza regime, US-backed Somoza regime, out of their country. They came back to power after 16 years of neoliberalism. They understand national sovereignty. They value it, and they will continue to preserve that. I think they are probably the strongest example of a people who understands the need to preserve national sovereignty and the ability to do it. These people are fighters. And I say that as far, politically they are, economically they are, and we all know that they're perfectly capable of pushing an empire out of their country. So they're very inspiring. For Venezuela, the economic development is happening in a much different way. They have been under sanctions since December of 2014, and increasingly more and more a stranglehold, specifically with the Trump administration, August of 2017. The most inspiring thing for me in Venezuela is the Venezuelan people, given what they have survived during these years of economic warfare, that they are still there, that they are still fighting, and they as well are fighting to preserve their national sovereignty and build a nation in their own vision. The number one consistent phrase I heard on the 21st of November in Venezuela, election day there, was sovereignty is not negotiable.
Thank you, Teri. So I guess a little bit focused more on Nicaragua still. That's clearly, sort of in the target of the United States in terms of destabilization. Countries that take on an independent path economically, politically, are quickly demonized in order to try to contain, what the U.S. would consider sort of the spread of an alternative way of economic, political organization. So around, maybe a question for Michelle around Nicaragua. Before the results ever came in for the elections, the electoral process, the U.S. was already demonizing the election, saying that it was going to be, that it was fraudulent, that it wasn't going to reflect the will of the people. What would you, or what do you think people can do who live in the north in what we call, the belly of the beast? What can they do? What's the best method of, supporting the people in the global south when they undertake independent projects in order to provide spaces for these projects to germinate and to flourish? What would you suggest for people who live in the belly of the beast?
Raul, that's a great question. And something that I've been thinking about a lot, especially thinking about the pernicious nature of the bourgeois press. Nicaragua has lost so much to this press apparatus that is led by the Chamorro family. And if you look back over the decades, the Chamorro family has played a role in every reactionary movement in Nicaragua over the past century. And, I think too about the role the press played, for example, in a country like Egypt, which, it was also a bourgeois press, and it helped fuel a coup against Morsi and the subsequent Rabia al-Adawiya massacre, which was just a horrific massacre, which, we have to really think about the role that the bourgeois press plays in feeding citizens of the global north complete fabrications about life in the global south. And my recommendation is to just educate yourself. Educate yourself so that you can intervene in those casual conversations that are happening in your friend groups, that are happening in your workplace, that strive to paint this popular project in Nicaragua as something demonic or something that is anti-human when it is fundamentally so life-affirming. And so I think just as we've seen the role of the press in perpetuating Zionist apartheid in Palestine, in every other country, in the coup in Honduras, as we were just speaking, we have to really realize that the press is not our friend. We need to divest from this press apparatus, and Nicaragua is a really easy country to travel to. There's many organizations now that are starting up delegations. So I really recommend that. There's no greater experience than seeing a project like this in person. And it also will give you the energy and the inspiration to continue your own social movement work in the North.
I totally agree with Michelle's comments, but specifically regarding U.S. interventionism in Nicaragua, not just physical military interventions, but economic and media and all these different forms. I personally do not believe it's going to work this time around. And I say that because of this sense of national sovereignty that exists in Nicaragua. I say it because the Nicaraguan people, as a nation of people, know how to fight. And also very specific to Nicaragua, and this has more to do with economic warfare. This is a nation that is 95% food sovereign. This is a nation that can feed itself, does not import its food. So they are not going to be starved out of their country, out of their government, out of power. They also are, I believe, close to 74% renewable energy, with the exception of transportation. They can turn the lights on in their homes and their schools and their public facilities with renewable energy. So again, they're not going to be able to be, cut off or slow down their country due to oil imports. Some of their transportation is going to be affected by that. But this form of warfare, this foreign policy of economic strangulation that the United States has is going to play out very differently in Nicaragua than what we have seen specifically in Cuba and Venezuela, other nations in the world as well, but to the hemisphere of the Americas, specific to Cuba and Venezuela. It's going to play out very, very differently in Nicaragua. And I think that's something that we need to watch. And as far as what we can do back home, we've got to push to get this Renaissance Act lifted. And that's going to take a lot more organizing. There's a terrific group of people formed with the Nicaragua Network out of AFGJ that worked very, very hard to prevent the legislation from getting signed in the first place. And now we're going to have to, really work to lessen it and, if not fully, remove it.
I've been visiting Venezuela for a long time, but I hadn't had a chance to go in a long time until most recently to participate, accompanying this election. And it's immediately obvious the effects of U.S. unilateral coercive measures. You can tell that obviously the objective of this is collective punishment. This is a war against the people of Venezuela, so that they suffer so much that they themselves try to change the government. Obviously, we saw the results. We saw that the Venezuelan people continue to support their project. We saw that the opposition lost. So, Raul, even with all these illegal and immoral sanctions that, as we saw ourselves, that are really affecting the Venezuelan economy and the people and are responsible for the deaths of thousands of people, we should remember, we saw the return of the opposition in these elections. But, they weren't able to win very many governorships, which was obviously the big items, the big contests in this election. And so why does the Bolivarian project continue to win? What lessons can we learn from their victory? What does it say about the opposition? Talk to us about what you saw and what you experienced in Venezuela.
I think in terms of what it says about the opposition is that it's very clear that the opposition has a history and is rooted in a very anti-democratic process. So the opposition has historically ruled the country since the 50s in what was known as El Punto Fijo, a pact between the elite parties. And they believe, and I believe it's still current today, their mindset is there's an arrogance that they believe that they are the owners and they should be the rightful rulers of Venezuela. So they don't have to put forward much of a project for the Venezuelan people. So their idea is that if they just run for elections, then they're just going to win because they're the rightful owners of the country historically. And I think that's what has changed. And that's what the Bolivarian revolution for the last 21 years has done, is basically it has taken power from these elites who today, obviously, even though they participate in the elections, they still don't accept, the electoral moral victory of the Bolivarian project. So I think that arrogance of the Venezuelan opposition, where we saw that they don't have a project, and so they have very little to no support and legitimacy in the country. Obviously, their support comes externally from the U.S. and from international actors, but in their country they have none. So they have resorted. They'll kind of resort to whatever is possible in order to try to win some type of political power. We know it's not. They've tried it through violence. They've tried it through electoral process, but by and large, they know that they can't win through the electoral process. So I think they were hoping in these elections that with the almost the destruction of the Venezuelan economy, the impact that it's had to socially, politically, to the missions in Venezuela, that just through that inertia that there would be enough anti-Maduro or anti-Bolivarian support. And it was clear that just like the U.S. they don't have a good read of what the Bolivarian revolution does for the people or what the Venezuelan people need. I think in terms of what it says about the Bolivarian project is very simple. The Bolivarian project has really taken power, as I said earlier on, from the elites and transferred that to the people, to the campesinos, to the workers, from allowing them to build and own their own homes, to providing healthcare, education. A lot of the social services which the country has historically suffered from is now something that is accessible. Obviously, with the sanctions, it has made it very difficult, and a lot of that has changed. But I think what it continues to tell you is that the United States and countries like Canada, who continue to have a foreign policy which is myopic, and it's based on colonialism, it's based on racism, it's based on an imperialist view that the people in the global South don't know what's good for them, and the governments in the North actually do know what's good for them. And if need be, they will impose that on the people in the global South. People of Venezuelans have showed that it doesn't matter what you throw at them. They're not going to kneel down and accept whatever is imposed upon them. And I think it shows a determination, a strength of the people that, as I think it was Teri mentioned, that sovereignty is not negotiable. And though there are obviously many people in Venezuela and in different parts that may not be, fully committed to the Bolivarian project. They may not even be supporters of Maduro, for example, but it's clear that, they would have rather vote for the PSUV or Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution than any other political party in the country or coalition, because they don't have anything to offer. And basically kneeling down and doing whatever is imposed on you from external isn't an option for Venezuelans. And I think that's what's kind of showing us since I was there.
Yeah, and I think one important point to pay attention to as well is that the opposition is notoriously divided. And in fact, if you look at the statements that the United States and Canada issued, they use their usual boilerplate language. They weren't free and fair, but they have nothing to point to anymore. It's important to say that in this election in Venezuela, it was actually also accompanied by observers from the European Union. So that myth that they've constructed that Venezuela is a dictatorship is already starting to crumble, even in the eyes of people in imperialist countries. And so the divided opposition is also a really important factor in this. And so much so that, if you look at the language that the US and Canada use in response, they're trying to blame Maduro for the opposition. The opposition does not need any help to continue to be divided. And that's because they have an incoherent strategy. They're not able to actually come together because they're not actually offered to anything other than get those other guys out of power because we deserve to be in power. That entitlement that exists amongst so much of the opposition. And one final thing I have to say is also, as usual, imperialism tends to underestimate the power of the revolutionary forces. They thought that after brutal sanctions, after coup attempts and coup plots in Venezuela, that the people would give in and just say, you know what, we'd rather get out of this situation by any means. If that means going back and betraying the revolution, well, of course they were mistaken. That is not happening. There is still a revolutionary subject in Venezuela that is the Venezuelan masses who will not let themselves be abused in this manner.
I think that's a good point in terms of how they underestimate, the processes in Latin America. Just an anecdote, I remember reading some transcript from the Canadian government in terms of, reporting on what was happening in Venezuela to, I guess, Parliament or to the Standing Committee. And one of the things that they made clear that kind of showed their lack of understanding, or at least ignorance of the situation in Venezuela, was they were saying that, they expected that when Guaido was, proclaimed interim president, that would really consolidate everybody behind Guaido, and that would, very shortly after that, Maduro would fall. So they were convinced, at least from a Canadian perspective, and I'm sure the US as well, that this was the end of the Bolivarian Revolution, just because, they had now a fictitious leader that was going to lead the opposition. And it just shows you how grossly they underestimate, and how, in my opinion, is, they're ignorant of the situation on the ground, and they construct a myth around what's going on in countries like Nicaragua, like Venezuela, that it's a dictatorship, that nobody supports the government. And I think they start to believe that narrative, unfortunately. And so their policies continue to be sort of circular, trying to overthrow a government that really, in most cases, has quite a lot of support from the people on the ground.
Raul, you and I were in Venezuela in December of 2020 for the National Assembly elections there. And we had, I think it was the Saturday before Election Day, we had a meeting with the majority opposition parties, one member from each. I think there were 14 people in the room with us that afternoon. And it was fascinating to hear what they had to say, because this is the opposition, which is the majority of the parties that participates in the Venezuelan electoral process. Their story is seldom to never articulated in the Western media. All we hear in the Western media is about the Guaido, Leopoldo Lopez faction of the Venezuelan opposition. And that is the faction of the wealthy business class that is backed by the United States. There are all these other opposition players who have continued to participate in the Venezuelan electoral process. And they opened that meeting by saying that, quote unquote, we believe the Venezuelan electoral process is free, fair, and absent of fraud. They were clear they have a different economic and political vision for the country, but believe in making change through the constitutional process, which includes participating in election. In November of this year, last month, in part due to the initial success of the Venezuelan dialogue here in Mexico City, the entire Venezuelan opposition participated in the regional and municipal elections on November 21. That has not happened since 2017. So there is this shift, however slight, that is happening. And I will go back to, the this theme of preserving national sovereignty. And Raul, you had mentioned that, there is the peso won so large in November in Venezuela because the opposition does not offer any united, cohesive message or plan for Venezuela as a nation of people. But I will also say they voted for the PSUV because the PSUV and its respective governments under Chavez and Maduro have kept the US military so far out of that country, have preserved the nation of Venezuela. And people really, really value that. Those people in Venezuela, I have to tell you, and I get very emotional when I talk about this, they have survived so much and are still standing as a nation. And that is because of them as a people. And they are voting to preserve that for themselves. And it's a really profound thing to witness. So it's optimistic. I should also say, just in having been in 3 countries in November observing elections, the technical process of voting in Venezuela is like none other I have seen in the world, including the United States. How it's automated, it's easy to use, it's so easy to count the votes, fraud-free. You have election results within hours of polls closing. It's incomparable to anything else that I witnessed this month, including, voting in my own country.
That's a good point. We can never forget how technologically advanced, secure, and transparent the Bolivarian electoral process is. So maybe a question for José Luis, and this is around Honduras specifically. I guess in terms of what's changed in Honduras, because we know historically that the electoral system is marred with fraud and corruption. We saw this in 2013 with Xiomara Castro had her election stolen from her. We saw it in 2017 when Juan Orlando was reelected. Again, it was plagued with irregularities, according to international observers like the OAS. So what has changed in Honduras this time around that allowed the people to break through this institutional corruption and fraud that I'm sure is still there?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this question. So in terms of the freer conditions that existed, we have to be clear that this was a product of struggle. This was a product of the movement and the Libre Party pushing to make sure that there were necessary reforms that needed to happen to reduce the possibility, not eliminate, but reduce the possibility of fraud. And there was definitely a lot of irregularities on the day of the vote. And we're talking about naked vote buying, literally having people from representing the National Party outside of polling centers, grabbing people by the arm, pulling them into their tent, offering them goods. We're talking about working class, low income communities, and be like, hey, if you vote for us, we're going to give you roofing materials so that when it rains, your house doesn't leak anymore, or flooring materials so that you don't have dirt floors in your house. That can go a long way to maybe someone who's undecided succumbing to that kind of temptation, or even offering cash and being like, here's some money. If you vote for us and we win, we'll give you this money. Or, if you don't vote for us and you don't win, that social program that you're enjoying, it's going to disappear. So, but here's the thing. When I arrived here in Honduras, I did, as any good journalist does, and I just started talking to people, and it was immediately evident that there was a mood for change. In fact, I kept telling people who were on the delegation with us that they reminded me a lot of Mexico in 2018. There comes a point where the masses, or the working class, where the oppressed can no longer take it. And no matter what you do with your fraudulent efforts, with your vote manipulation, with your threats of violence, they're not going to continue to support this regime. And that's what happened. That's what happened in Mexico 2018. That's what happened here in Honduras. The 12 years of National Party rule, the 8 years of the Juan Orlando Hernandez regime were too much. They were too abusive. The people said, we cannot stand with it. I talked to a number of people who said, I've been a National Party supporter my whole life. My family have been National Party supporters our whole lives. We're not going to vote for them this time around. And so that's, I think, what saw that wave of support for Xiomara and the Libre Party. And that was just so great that it didn't matter how much they tried to steal the vote. They probably did steal a bunch of the votes. And actually, we're seeing now that there's a lot of movements to try to rob Libre of a majority in the Congress. So they're up to their own dirty tricks. But when it came to the presidential election, the mood was just too great. And that's what made it so that, that 5% of the vote that you usually can squeeze out and switch to your side, it wasn't enough. when you win by almost 20 points, doesn't matter what you do, that is too overwhelming for even the most fraudulent of activities to defeat it. And that speaks to, as I said at the very beginning of this program, the experience on the streets. No escuela como la escuela de la calle. There's no school like what you learn on the streets. The people have been on the streets battling. There was the efforts of privatization, the abuses around COVID. They promised they were going to build hospitals. They spent these millions of dollars and they did nothing. The people remember that. They know what it was like to face the fraud. We worked with a lot of young people as part of the observation here in Honduras, people who were too young to really know what was going on during the coup. Pero son los hijos del golpe. They're the children of the coup. They grew up neoliberal nightmare that sprung up in the wake of the coup. And they said, no, we're going to do our part as well.
Teri, any thoughts?
I want to pick up on something that José Luis said, and that I witnessed as well in Honduras on the 28th of November, was seeing the political bribing for votes by the National Party, offering food, housing, flooring for housing, roofs for housing, food for your family. The irony of that is here you have a political party that supports privatization, that supports the neoliberal paradigm, understanding that people would potentially vote for you if you offered them things that better their daily life. So the National Party is saying on election day, well, we'll give you all these things for your vote. Then you turn to countries like Nicaragua and Venezuela with governments and economies who understand it is the government's responsibility to deliver these products to people, to keep the entire nation, the entire population at a level of existence that is beneficial. And that includes food, housing, schools, electricity, running water, roofs on your houses. So the irony, of these political parties that support neoliberalism, understanding on election day and only on election day what is necessary to provide people in order for them to support you, versus these long-range governmental, political, and economic projects that understand the need to deliver to the people on a fundamental level every day and are doing it. And that is one of the reasons why those governments consistently have received support from their people.
Well, that's all we have for the program today. I want to thank all of you for participating. I'm your host, José Luis Granados Ceja, and the producer is Raul Burbano. And today we had two very special guests, Michelle Munjanattu and Teri Mattson, who have been accompanying political processes in Latin America for a number of years. And I have to say, as a Latin American myself, I really appreciate that kind of solidarity. It really does matter. It really does make a difference. That granito de arena, putting your contribution really does matter. And I do appreciate that. And I appreciate all our listeners who joined us today on this program to hear and learn about what things are happening, how the intersection of election and popular power and political struggle is happening. But I do want to offer everybody final opportunity to close out the program and share one final word with everybody who's listening.
Thank you, José Luis. I just want to finish by saying that observing these processes makes me, understand more than ever the urgency of committing to political revolution in our countries of origin. As the processes started in Nicaragua in 1979 and then in Venezuela, of course, we saw the beginnings of that in the Caracazo. Once the revolution is set in motion, it's very hard to turn it back. And once revolution finds a home in an individual, they're able to defend it during hard periods, as we saw when Cuba experienced a special period in the 90s and when Nicaragua underwent the neoliberal period around that same time. And even today, I have such a strong sense from Venezuelans about their commitment to their homeland that I don't doubt the future of the revolution, because they understand themselves as protagonists in the process. And so they are going to safeguard the project in their hearts and also in their work until the revolution is on firmer ground. And I know it will get there.
I think, what's important is that as long as we continue to depend on the mainstream media, our governments, usually neoliberal governments, to interpret what's going on in Latin America and in the global South, we're going to continue to be misled and misinformed. And I think that's a travesty for the majority of the people living in the global North. They don't really have a good sense of what's going on because of the massive misinformation. And Teri sort of mentioned it earlier on that, when something gets repeated so often, there's so much misinformation, the lie becomes a truth, right? It's very hard to kind of break through that. And I think that's why it's really important for us in the global north, at least, to develop some kind of, electoral observatory, for example. It's very important for people in the north to go to the global south, especially during the electoral process, not so much to, accompany the electoral process. I mean, it's great. And in some cases it's needed, but more to learn and to exchange, right? To develop that exchange between the people on the ground, whether it's through their electoral process or whatever the project. Because I think that's one of the main things that we've lost, which is that articulation between social movements, between civil society of the North and the South. And we've left it to institutions, NGOs, I don't know what political parties to do that for us. And I think when people go down or when people come up to the North and we interact, we exchange, we kind of start the dialogue, it really helps all of us learn what is really happening. And so, I'm become a big advocate of developing a global elections observatory where we can actually build on this, even though electoral processes are only, they're a point in time, they're not the whole and the most important aspect of any process by any means, but it's definitely important in order it gives us a window to unite and to articulate in a way that we don't always get to on a regular basis.
I just want to add one quick comment, having been in 3 countries the month of November, watching 3 different countries vote and the political activities surrounding that. But in the countries I visited this month, it is so very clear that the populations understand U.S. foreign policy far better than those of us who are U.S. citizens of the United States. And part of that is due to the media narrative. Part of it is due to lack of leaving the country and visiting, spending time on the ground, and not just as a tourist, but as a visitor. But that understanding of U.S. foreign policy is what is going to help these nations evolve past it. They have all been victims of U.S. foreign policy for 100 years or more, and before that, British and before that, Spanish imperialism. They understand what they're up against, and they are building social and political and economic processes to move beyond it. And I believe they will be successful because of how profoundly they understand U.S. imperialism, and not just political, military, but economic as well.